My 8-year-old son stood shaking on my front porch, holding a hastily wrapped box. "Grandma said to tell you not to make a scene," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The second I ripped off the paper and saw the glass pipe and the white powder inside, I did not scream or flush it down the toilet like they expected. I dialed 911 on myself. 10 minutes later, 3 police officers were in my living room when my husband walked through the front door expecting to find Child Protective Services. His face drained of all color when the lead officer turned to him holding the evidence bag. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who tried to destroy your life. Trust me, you will want to hear how I turned their ultimate trap into a federal crime scene. I am Jasmine, 35 years old, and my mother, Vivian, had just orchestrated the most vicious attack of my life. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Buckhead, an affluent neighborhood in Atlanta, where appearances are everything. I pulled Malik inside my maternal instincts, battling against the cold, analytical training I use every day as a senior forensic auditor. My hands were perfectly steady as I placed the box on the kitchen island. Malik wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face in my skirt. His small body was trembling violently. I rubbed his back, soothing him with soft words while taking a mental inventory of the items Vivian had so carefully arranged inside the tissue paper. First, there was a forged positive drug test with my name printed clearly across the top. Second, a thick stack of legal documents. They were pre-filled voluntary custody surrender forms, explicitly granting my husband Terrence full physical and legal custody of Malik. And finally, the crown jewel of my mother's setup rested at the bottom of the box. It was a clear plastic bag containing a suspicious white powder and a used glass pipe. This was Vivian's playbook. I did not need to guess the strategy or wonder how they planned to execute it. Growing up, whenever my younger sister Kendra failed a class, wrecked a luxury car, or threw a tantrum at the country club, Vivian expertly shifted the blame to me. I was the difficult, ungrateful, dark-skinned daughter who ruined the perfect aesthetic of her light-skinned, high-society family portrait. Kendra was the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the scapegoat who could do nothing right. Vivian always viewed my sharp, analytical mind not as an asset, but as a threat to her carefully curated social image. She hated that I saw through her fake Southern charm. She hated that I did not need her money. And most of all, she hated that I refused to bow to Preston Kendra's wealthy white corporate lawyer husband, who Vivian treated like a god simply because of his race and his bank account. Now she was using that same ruthless social climbing energy to try and take my son. She expected me to panic. She wanted me to act like the aggressive, unstable woman she always told everyone I was. She anticipated that I would grab the bag of drugs and flush it down the toilet to protect my prestigious career, thereby destroying the evidence of her crime just before Child Protective Services knocked on my door to search the house. She wanted me caught in a lie, looking hysterical and guilty. I refused to play her game. I picked up my phone and dialed the police. I reported a hazardous unknown substance left on my property and requested officers immediately. I did not touch the box again. I took Malik by the hand, led him to the sofa, put on his favorite cartoon, and waited. My mind worked in overdrive, analyzing the angles, calculating the risks, and preparing my defense. A forensic auditor does not react to fraud with emotion. We react with paper trails and undeniable evidence. 3 officers arrived within 10 minutes. They walked into my home expecting chaos. Instead, they found a calm, professionally dressed woman standing in a pristine foyer. I directed them to the kitchen island, pointing to the box without crossing the threshold of the room. I explained exactly what was in the package, who had handed it to my son, and the specific custody documents resting beneath the contraband. I provided them with my identification, my business card, stating my title as a federal financial investigator, and the contact information for my lawyer. The officers exchanged glances, clearly realizing this was not a standard domestic call. They pulled on their blue nitrile gloves and began photographing the scene. They were in the middle of carefully bagging the pipe and the white powder when the heavy oak front door handle clicked. The door swung open. Terrence, my husband of 10 years, strode in wearing his tailored charcoal suit. He had a practiced look of fake concern already plastered on his face. His shoulders were slumped in a perfect imitation of a devastated father. He expected to find social workers tearing my life apart, finding the planted evidence and handing Malik over to him. He expected me to be in handcuffs screaming and crying. Instead, he found 3 uniformed police officers staring back at him, holding the exact evidence he and my mother had conspired to plant. Terrence stopped dead in his tracks. The color vanished from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Police," he stammered, his eyes darting from the officers to me, and finally to the evidence bag resting on the granite counter. What happened? What is going on here? Before Terrence could transition into playing the concerned, clueless father, the lead officer stepped forward. He held up the clear plastic bag with a gloved hand, his expression stern. "Sir," the officer said, his voice flat and authoritative, "your wife showed us the security camera footage from the front porch. The cameras caught a woman matching your mother-in-law's description, using your specific access code to enter the house 2 hours ago to leave this package. Care to explain how she got your private security code and why she is dropping off narcotics at your residence?" Terrence opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His hands began to shake violently. The expensive smartphone he was holding slipped from his sweaty grip and hit the hardwood floor with a loud crack. The screen illuminated instantly, displaying a newly arrived text message in bold, unmistakable letters. It was from my sister, Kendra. "Is the brat gone? Did Child Protective Services take him yet?" The flashing blue and red lights painted the school parking lot in harsh, unforgiving strokes. I did not stay to watch them push Terrence into the back of the squad car. I had exactly one priority. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Tara, my closest friend since our college days at Spelman. She answered on the first ring. I gave her brief, precise instructions. 10 minutes later, she pulled her SUV into the far end of the lot. I walked Malik over, kissed his forehead, and promised him everything was going to be perfectly fine. Tara locked eyes with me and nodded. She did not ask questions. She knew the history of Vivian and Kendra. She drove away with my son safely secured, and I got into my own car to follow the police cruisers downtown. The precinct smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I sat on a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded in my lap. I was not the hysterical wife they usually saw in these situations. A forensic auditor does not unravel in the face of conflict. We observe, we catalog, we wait for the numbers to tell the story. A detective with a weary expression finally approached me holding a clipboard. He sighed and told me Terrence was demanding to speak with me before he called his lawyer. The detective warned me I did not have to go in there, but I stood up without hesitation. I needed to see him. I needed to look the man I had married in the eye and watch the last remnants of our decade-long facade burn to the ground. The interrogation room was exactly as cold and gray as you see on television. Terrence was sitting at a metal table, his hands resting on the scarred surface. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, his shoulders relaxed. The panicked, begging husband from the parking lot vanished entirely. In his place sat the arrogant, resentful man I had been quietly carrying for 10 years. His face twisted into a sneer that made his handsome features look suddenly hollow. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You just could not let it go," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You always have to be the smartest person in the room, Jasmine. You always have to make everyone else look like a fool." I pulled out the metal chair opposite him and sat down. I did not raise my voice. I asked him why he let Vivian plant narcotics in our home. I asked him why he allowed my mother and my sister to traumatize his own son just to trigger a Child Protective Services raid. Terrence let out a short, harsh laugh. He leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing. "Because you left us no choice," he snapped. "You are a paranoid, career-obsessed failure of a wife. You abandoned me, Jasmine. You are always buried in those spreadsheets, working 80-hour weeks, flying across the country for audits. You never supported my visions. You never supported my businesses. Vivian and Kendra had to step in because you neglected me. They gave me the financial respect I deserved while you hoarded your paycheck and treated me like a dependent. I stared at him, marveling at the absolute delusion. For a decade, I had paid the mortgage on our Buckhead home. I had covered the car notes. I had quietly settled the debts from his 3 failed startup companies so he could save face at his golf club. He had spent years weaponizing my demanding career against me, playing the neglected, emotionally starved victim to my mother and sister. Vivian ate it up. She loved playing savior to the handsome son-in-law, handing him cash under the table, while using his complaints as further proof that I was an aggressive, unlovable woman who could not keep a man happy. Kendra, ever the dutiful echo to Vivian, loved having another reason to look down on me. You helped them frame me to steal custody of Malik, I stated, keeping my tone perfectly even. You were willing to let me go to prison. Terrence smiled then. It was a cold, satisfied smile. It is not just about custody, Jasmine. It is about taking back what you owe me. You think you are so untouchable with your federal job and your corporate suits, but you have nothing left. I tilted my head, inviting him to elaborate. In any investigation, the target's arrogance is always their greatest vulnerability. Give a narcissist a captive audience, and they will hand you the rope to hang them with. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. I am not going down for that glass pipe. Preston is handling everything. Your sister's husband is a very powerful corporate attorney, in case you forgot. Preston pushed an emergency ex parte order through a family court judge he plays golf with every Sunday. He convinced the judge you are an unstable flight risk. As of 1 hour ago, every joint bank account we have is completely frozen. The house is seized pending the divorce settlement. You have absolutely nothing. You cannot pay a lawyer. You cannot pay for a hotel. You are going to be sleeping on a park bench by midnight. He sat back, reveling in his perceived victory. He expected me to shatter. He expected me to cry, to beg, to ask how he could be so cruel. He wanted the satisfaction of watching the strong, independent woman break into a million pieces. I simply looked at my watch. It was a beautiful piece, understated but precise. Then I looked back at him. Is that all, Terrence? His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. You are bluffing, he sneered. You are sitting there with $0 to your name, and you think you can stare me down. Preston is posting my bail as we speak. I am walking out of here, and you are going to be ruined. The heavy door opened. A junior lawyer from Preston's firm stepped into the room holding a stack of release papers. He handed them to the detective standing in the hallway. Terrence stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from his tailored suit jacket. He adjusted his cuffs, shot me one final look of absolute triumph, and walked out the door. He truly believed he had won. He believed he had left me utterly destitute. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair under the metal table. I walked out of the interrogation room and made my way through the bustling precinct. I stepped out into the humid Atlanta afternoon. The bright sunlight hit my face, but I felt nothing but a sharp, exhilarating clarity. I walked to my car, got into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Terrence thought I was just a standard employee at a downtown accounting firm. He thought the joint account he drained this morning was my entire life savings. He forgot who he married. While he was out playing golf with Preston, desperately trying to secure his place in the high society Vivian worshipped, I was climbing the ranks in forensic auditing. I specialized in tracing hidden corporate assets. I reached into the hidden compartment of my center console and pulled out a secondary burner phone. I did not open my banking app to check the frozen checking account. I knew it was empty. Instead, I opened a secure, encrypted portal. I typed in my credentials and navigated to the dashboard of an offshore holding company, registered under a proxy limited liability corporation. The screen loaded. The balance read $4.2 million. It was the accumulated consulting royalties from a proprietary auditing software I had patented 3 years ago. I had kept it completely hidden, preparing for the day my family's toxicity finally crossed the line into criminality. I smiled, the corners of my mouth lifting as I stared at the numbers. Terrence and Preston thought they were criminal masterminds, But in their rush to drain my checking account and freeze my assets, they made a fatal error. I had deliberately linked that specific joint account to a federal audit deposit account I used for government contracts. By moving that money without authorization, Terrence did not just rob his wife in a domestic dispute. He had inadvertently committed federal wire fraud. And by processing the ex parte order, using those stolen funds, Preston had tied his prestigious law firm directly to the crime. They thought they had stripped me of my power. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to their destruction. I put the burner phone back in the console, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. It was time to go to church. I pulled my car out of the precinct lot and navigated through the heavy Atlanta traffic, the harsh midday sun glaring off the asphalt. I did not drive directly to Vivian's Buckhead estate. I needed a secure connection and complete silence. I routed my car into the subterranean parking garage of a commercial high-rise downtown, scanning my badge to access the private executive levels. I parked in a dark, isolated corner, cut the engine, and left the air conditioning running. The hum of the vents was the only sound in the vehicle as I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I linked it to the secondary burner phone I had retrieved from my glove box, establishing a completely untraceable secure hotspot. For 10 years, Terrence treated me like a glorified bookkeeper. He looked at my modest bi-weekly direct deposits from the downtown accounting firm and scoffed. He complained that my salary barely covered the mortgage on our house, deliberately ignoring the fact that his own income was entirely consumed by his country club memberships, his luxury car leases, and his endless string of failed startup ventures. He thought I was just a standard employee grinding out tax forms for corporate clients. He genuinely believed that by freezing our joint checking account, he had successfully cut off my air supply. He forgot that my actual specialty was forensic auditing, a field where I spent my days dismantling the complex financial webs of corrupt executives. What Terrence never knew and what my family could never comprehend was the true nature of the late nights I spent staring at my computer screen. 3 years ago, while Terrence was out drinking with his fraternity brothers and complaining to my mother about his neglected marriage, I was writing code. I developed and patented a highly specialized machine learning forensic auditing software. It was designed to detect microscopic anomalies in ledger transfers, flagging the kind of sophisticated shell games that traditional auditors routinely missed. Within 6 months of its creation, federal agencies and private financial sectors began licensing the software. I knew my marriage was deteriorating. I knew Vivian and Kendra would eventually convince Terrence that he deserved better than a dark-skinned, career-driven woman who refused to bow to their social hierarchy. Anticipating his inevitable betrayal, I placed the patent and all subsequent royalties into a blind trust. Those funds were routed directly to an offshore holding company managed under a proxy limited liability corporation in the Cayman Islands. Completely legal, perfectly taxed, and entirely invisible to anyone looking at my domestic marital assets. I typed my credentials into the secure portal and bypassed the two-factor authentication. The screen refreshed, displaying the dashboard of my holding company. The balance loaded in crisp green text, $4.2 million. I stared at the number, feeling the cold, hard reality of my absolute financial security wash over me. I was not a victim. I was not trapped. I was a fully funded adversary, armed and ready for a war my family did not even realize they had started. I opened a secure messaging application and initiated a video call with David, the lead counsel of my private legal team. David was ruthless, brilliant, and completely unbothered by the messy realities of family law. His face appeared on my screen, framed by the sleek background of his Buckhead office. I gave him a rapid clinical summary of the morning's events. I detailed the planted drugs, the forged custody surrender forms, the police intervention, and Terrence's boast in the interrogation room regarding the frozen accounts. David's expression hardened into a look of professional disgust. He pulled up the Fulton County digital docket on his end, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he searched for the emergency freeze order Terrence had described. It took him less than 3 minutes to locate the filing. Preston submitted an ex parte order to seize the accounts and halt your access to the residential property. David confirmed, his eyes scanning the digital document. But this timeline is completely fractured, Jasmine. An ex parte motion of this magnitude filed on a Friday evening requires a judge to sign off in person after reviewing credible evidence of immediate irreparable harm. I am looking at the signature block right now. Judge Aris is listed as the approving magistrate. I pulled up my own cross-referencing database while David spoke. Judge Aris is currently in Savannah, I said smoothly. He is attending a 3-day judicial conference. He has been out of the city since Thursday afternoon. He could not have physically signed that order. David enhanced the document on his screen, analyzing the digital metadata attached to the signature block. Preston did not get a judge. David stated, a sharp edge of disbelief in his voice. He used a digital administrative stamp. He bypassed the bench entirely by inputting the credentials of a court clerk to force the system into freezing your assets. This is not just a breach of ethics, Jasmine. This is a severe federal offense. He just committed forgery and fraud as an officer of the court. Preston's arrogance had finally outpaced his intellect. He was so accustomed to operating with total impunity, so used to bulldozing through obstacles with his wealth and his race as a shield, that he assumed no one would ever verify his paperwork. He thought he could crush me with a few keystrokes and suffer zero consequences. He had just handed me the weapon I needed to dismantle his entire career. I authorized David to immediately file a motion to quash the fraudulent order and initiate a formal complaint with the State Bar Association. But as I prepared to close the laptop and head to my mother's brunch, my instincts flared. Preston was greedy, but he was also a coward. To take a risk, this massive bypassing a judge and committing outright forgery to freeze my modest domestic accounts, meant he was desperate. He needed Terrence to gain full custody of my son immediately, and he needed it bad enough to risk disbarment. Kendra's text message echoed in my mind. Is the brat gone? Why the sudden vicious urgency to get Malik out of my house? I opened the back-end interface of my proprietary auditing software. I did not log off. I needed to see exactly how desperate Preston was. I bypassed the standard security protocols and initiated a deep diagnostic sweep of Preston's prestigious corporate law firm. I instructed the algorithm to bypass their public filings and focus exclusively on the metadata of their escrow accounts and client trust funds over the past 12 months. I set the parameters to look for routing anomalies, fractional skimming, and unauthorized offshore transfers. I sat in the quiet of my car watching the progress bar load. The software chewed through thousands of encrypted data packets, cross-referencing ledger entries with actual bank deposits. For 5 minutes, there was nothing but standard corporate billing. Then the software chimed. A glaring red alert flashed across my screen. The algorithm had flagged a continuous, highly irregular pattern of outgoing wires, originating from Preston's primary client trust account. Every 2 weeks, substantial amounts of money varying between $20,000 and $50,000 were being siphoned off. They were meticulously disguised in the firm's internal ledgers as retainer adjustments and phantom consulting fees. But my software stripped away the false labels and tracked the actual routing numbers. The stolen money was completely bypassing traditional clearinghouses. It was being quietly funneled into a regional community bank branch located deep in North Atlanta, completely isolated from Preston's primary financial footprint. My pulse quickened. I highlighted the destination routing code and executed a targeted search on the receiving account. I pulled the corporate registration of the shell company listed as the primary beneficiary of the stolen funds. The document loaded on my screen, revealing the signatures of the individuals who had established the LLC. The names hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer: Preston Hayes and Vivian Carter. I stopped breathing. I stared at the glowing letters on my screen, tracing the curve of my mother's signature. Vivian was not just socially ambitious. She was not just a toxic, manipulative parent who favored my sister. She was a co-conspirator in a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement ring. She and Preston were actively stealing from the law firm's clients. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. The sudden influx of cash Vivian used to renovate her Buckhead estate. The brand new Mercedes Kendra paraded around town. It was all funded by stolen trust money. But the embezzlement was a house of cards, and they were running out of cash to cover their tracks before the firm's senior partners initiated their annual audit. They needed liquid capital immediately to replace the stolen funds. They needed the $500,000 trust fund Malik's paternal grandfather had left him. The drug frame-up was never just about giving Terrence custody or pushing me out of the family. It was a calculated, vicious conspiracy to ruin my credibility, strip me of my parental rights, and give Terrence control of Malik's money so Preston and Vivian could drain it to save themselves from federal prison. I slowly closed my laptop, the screen going dark. The cold realization solidified into a pure, absolute rage. They did not just try to ruin my life. They tried to use my 8-year-old son as a pawn to cover their own felonies. I started the engine of my car. I put the vehicle in drive and pulled out of the parking garage, merging into the bright Atlanta traffic. I was no longer just the estranged daughter going to demand answers. I was the executioner, and it was time to collect. I pulled my car through the towering wrought iron gates of my mother's Buckhead estate. The circular driveway was already packed edge to edge with luxury vehicles, a gleaming sea of imported steel that reflected the harsh midday Atlanta sun. Valets in crisp white shirts hurried back and forth, jogging to keep up with the steady stream of arriving guests. I bypassed the valet line entirely, parking my sedan directly behind a catering van near the side entrance. I turned off the ignition and sat in the silence of my car for a moment, simply staring at the sprawling brick mansion before me. For 35 years, this house had been a monument to my inadequacy. It was the physical manifestation of Vivian's absolute demand for perfection, a fortress of high society expectations that I was never meant to conquer. She had designed every inch of this property to project the image of a flawless, devout, wealthy family. Yesterday, I would have looked at those towering Roman columns and the imported Italian marble fountain in the center courtyard and felt the familiar, suffocating weight of my mother's disapproval. I would have seen a matriarch who prioritized showing off to Atlanta's elite over loving her eldest, darker-skinned daughter. Today, armed with the encrypted data from my offshore server, I did not see a home. I looked at the estate through the cold, calculating lens of a federal financial investigator, and I saw an active crime scene. Every manicured rosebush, every crystal goblet waiting on the dining tables, every square foot of that imported marble had been paid for with stolen money. The realization stripped away decades of childhood trauma and replaced it with a sharp, exhilarating clarity. They were not better than me. They were just louder with their crimes. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored crimson suit. The color was a deliberate, calculated choice. Vivian mandated that her famous Sunday post-church brunches adhere to a strict, unspoken pastel color palette. She wanted everyone looking like a soft, compliant background extra in the movie of her own life. She required muted tones that blended easily into her floral arrangements, nothing that drew the eye, and certainly nothing that challenged her authority. I wore blood red. I walked up the sweeping front steps, my heels clicking sharply against the stone, and pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors. The grand foyer opened into a massive ballroom space, echoing with the sophisticated sounds of a live jazz trio playing in the corner. The scent of expensive catered food filled the air, roasted lamb, shrimp, and grits and sweet pastries. The room was packed with the most influential members of Atlanta's affluent African-American social circles. There were city council members holding crystal plates, mega church pastors shaking hands, and local judges sipping from champagne flutes. Vivian had spent months curating this specific guest list to solidify her social standing and prove her ultimate superiority. I stepped down into the main reception area. The effect of my entrance was instantaneous and cinematic. It was as if someone had pulled the main power cord on the sound system. The laughter closest to the door died out first, rippling outward until it infected the entire room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The clinking of expensive silverware against china abruptly stopped. The sea of pastel linen suits and modest church hats parted to make way for the woman in the crimson suit. I scanned the room, sweeping my gaze over the stunned faces of my mother's friends. I spotted my targets immediately. Vivian was holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows, flanked by Pastor Miller and his impeccably dressed wife. Vivian wore a pristine, tailored cream dress, projecting the ultimate image of a devout, flawless matriarch. A few feet away, Kendra was laughing loudly, draped heavily over Preston's arm. She was making a grand theatrical show of adjusting her hair deliberately, flashing a thick, blindingly bright diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. I recognized that specific piece of jewelry immediately. I had seen the exact withdrawal amount from Preston's client trust account matched to the jewelry store's invoice just 20 minutes ago in my car. Vivian saw me. For a fraction of a second, raw panic flashed behind her perfectly applied makeup. Her eyes darted around the room, frantically gauging the reactions of her high society guests. She quickly composed herself, forcing a rigid, terrifyingly fake smile onto her face. She excused herself from the pastor and marched toward me, her heels striking the marble floor like a gavel. She intercepted me before I could make it past the grand piano in the center of the room. "Jasmine, what an absolute shock," Vivian said loudly, ensuring her sweet, syrupy southern tone carried to the nearby guests who were openly staring. "We certainly did not expect you to join us today." She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging fiercely into the fine fabric of my suit, and pulled me a few steps into the hallway out of direct earshot of the church elders. Her smile remained fixed in place for the audience, but her voice dropped to a venomous, hateful hiss. "You have some nerve showing your face here after what you put Terrence through this morning." Vivian snarled, her eyes blazing with fury. "I know exactly what you did, calling the police like a hysterical lunatic. You are trying to ruin this family because you are too bitter and too ugly to keep your own household together." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers with a look of absolute boredom until she felt the shift in my energy and slowly let go. "I am perfectly fine, Vivian," I replied, keeping my voice even and entirely devoid of emotion. "I understand you had a very busy morning yourself. Dropping off packages takes so much energy, especially at your age." Vivian's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine fear crossing her features as she realized I knew exactly who had planted the drugs. But before she could snap back, Preston and Kendra walked over to join the confrontation. Preston used his height to his full advantage, puffing out his chest in his tailored navy blue suit. He had always used his status as a wealthy white corporate attorney to intimidate everyone in our family. He thrived on making me feel small, utilizing his race and his law degree as a bludgeon to make the rest of us feel inferior. Vivian worshipped him for it, treating him like a god simply because he validated her desperate need for high society integration. He looked down at me now, treating me like an uneducated subordinate rather than an equal. Kendra clung to his side, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Jasmine, I think it is time for you to leave," Preston said, utilizing his deepest, most authoritative courtroom voice. He crossed his arms, stepping into my personal space. "As Terrence's legal counsel, I am advising you that you are trespassing on private property. You are socially unfit to be in this room, and frankly, you are embarrassing your mother in front of her congregation." Kendra scoffed, shaking her head dramatically. "You always have to ruin everything, Jasmine. You could not just sign the custody papers and let Terrence have peace. You had to call the police and make a massive scene. You are completely unhinged. You are destroying the legacy of this family." Preston took another step closer, his blue eyes hard and threatening. "Sign the voluntary surrender documents by tomorrow morning, Jasmine. If you refuse, I will personally see to it that you are dragged through family court and destroyed. I have already secured an emergency ex parte order. I will freeze every asset you have ever touched, and I will make sure you never work in the city of Atlanta again. Do you understand me?" I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I turned away from him entirely, walking over to the crystal mimosa fountain set up on the side table. I picked up a delicate glass flute, held it under the spout, and slowly filled it with champagne and fresh orange juice. The sheer audacity of me ignoring his threat made a thick vein pop in the side of Preston's neck. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, savoring the taste. I set the glass down on a silver tray and turned back to face them. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy printed dossier. The cover page bore the official, unmistakable gold seal of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I stepped forward and slapped the manila folder directly against Preston's chest. He instinctively grabbed it before it could fall to the floor. "I would not worry about my career, Preston," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, lethal calm that caused the air in the hallway to drop 10 degrees. "I would worry about yours. Because the federal forensic auditor assigned to investigate your law firm for the multi-million-dollar embezzlement of client trust funds. That is me. And you just tried to blackmail a federal investigator." Preston's arrogant smirk did not just fade, it evaporated. He stood frozen in the opulent hallway of my mother's estate, his perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly as he stared down at the heavy manila folder. His eyes darted across the top page, scanning the bold federal letterhead and the meticulously highlighted columns of routing numbers. It was a preliminary audit report detailing his firm's internal transfers, and it was devastatingly precise. I watched his brain short-circuit as he tried to reconcile the woman standing before him with the terrifying reality of the document he had just seen. For years, Preston had operated under the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. He was a wealthy white corporate attorney who had married into a socially ambitious black family, and he used his race, his pedigree, and his law degree as a bludgeon to make the rest of us feel entirely inferior. Vivian worshipped him for it. To my mother, Preston was the ultimate trophy son-in-law. He represented the validation she had chased her entire life, a golden ticket into a tier of society she felt she inherently deserved. Vivian treated his casual condescension as sophistication. Whenever Preston spoke at family dinners, dropping legal jargon and boasting about his corporate conquests, Vivian would hang on his every word, shooting me pointed looks as if to ask why I could not secure a man of such magnificent stature. Preston knew exactly how to play her. He fed Vivian's narcissism while quietly treating my father, my son, and myself with barely concealed contempt. He viewed me as nothing more than an abrasive, low-level accountant who lacked the charm and compliance of my younger sister. He truly believed his intelligence and his privilege made him immune to consequence. But there is no privilege that can protect a man from a forensic algorithm. The spreadsheet he had just glanced at did not care about his country club memberships or his tailored suits. It simply displayed the undeniable mathematical proof that he had been systematically siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from his clients' trust accounts and routing the stolen funds into a shell company co-signed by my mother. I could see the exact second the gravity of his situation crushed him. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. A bead of sweat materialized at his temple. He opened his mouth to speak, but his usually booming, authoritative courtroom voice abandoned him. Only a ragged, shallow breath escaped his lips. I reached out and smoothly pulled the folder back, stepping away from him. The sudden loss of the document seemed to snap him out of his paralysis. Panic overrode his logic. He lunged forward, his large frame moving aggressively as he tried to snatch the folder back from my grasp. I simply took one calculated step backward. His hands swiped through empty air. He stumbled slightly, his heavy leather dress shoes scuffing against Vivian's pristine marble floor. "What is this nonsense?" Vivian hissed, stepping swiftly between us. She had witnessed Preston's uncharacteristic stumble and immediately moved to protect her golden child. Her face was flushed with a mixture of confusion and boiling rage. She reached out, attempting to snatch the folder from my hands herself. "Give that to me right now, Jasmine. Stop making a fool of yourself. You are causing a scene and ruining my brunch." She was still operating under the delusion that she was in control. She still believed she could manage me with sharp reprimands and maternal intimidation. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, terrified that the church elders, the city council members, or the local judges mingling in the grand ballroom had noticed the altercation in the hallway. Vivian thrived on these Sunday events. They were her grand theater. She used them to project the image of the perfect, devout, flawlessly wealthy family. My uninvited presence, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored crimson suit that aggressively clashed with her mandated pastel aesthetic, was an immediate, glaring threat to her carefully constructed narrative. Preston recovered his footing. He straightened his jacket, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to reconstruct his high-powered attorney persona. His eyes darted nervously toward the ballroom, mirroring Vivian's fear of a public scandal. "You need to leave this house right now, Jasmine," he demanded, keeping his voice in a harsh, strained whisper. "You do not understand what you are looking at in those documents. If you take this any further, if you do not leave right now, I will bury you so deep in litigation, you will never see the light of day. I will ruin you professionally." I looked at him. I did not yell. I did not match his frantic, chaotic energy. I remained perfectly still, radiating a cold, lethal calm. I turned my head and looked past Vivian, looking directly into the crowded ballroom. The jazz trio was softly playing a lively tune in the corner. Waiters were circulating with silver trays. The elite of Atlanta were laughing and gossiping, completely oblivious to the felony conspiracy unraveling just a few feet away. Vivian wanted an audience. She had spent her entire life performing for these people, curating a fake reality built on stolen money and shattered family members. I decided it was time for her grand finale. I poured myself a mimosa from the crystal fountain resting on the hallway credenza. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes never leaving Preston's ashen face. Then I projected my voice, utilizing the same clear, authoritative tone I used when addressing federal courtrooms. I spoke loud enough for the sound to carry over the piano music, loud enough to cut through the clinking of crystal and the hum of polite conversation. "The federal forensic auditor assigned to investigate your firm's embezzlement of client trust funds," I announced, my words ringing out with absolute, undeniable clarity. "That is me, Preston, and you just tried to illegally freeze the bank accounts of a federal investigator." The effect was instantaneous. The piano player fumbled, hitting a sharp, discordant key before bringing the music to a jarring halt. The polite chatter in the ballroom died instantly. Heads snapped in our direction. City council members lowered their plates. The pastor and his wife stared with wide, unblinking eyes. The heavy, suffocating silence of absolute scandal descended upon the room. Every single person in Vivian's curated elite circle was now staring directly at the golden son-in-law and the flawless matriarch. I watched Preston's face. The hubris that had defined his entire existence shattered completely. Absolute, unadulterated panic flashed in his pale blue eyes. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and finally realized gravity was real. His mouth opened and closed silently, his legal mind frantically searching for a loophole, a defense, a lie to spin to the audience currently watching his destruction. He found nothing. He was paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming exposure of his crimes. Vivian looked as though she had been physically struck. Her jaw dropped, her perfectly styled hair suddenly seeming rigid. She looked from me to the sea of staring faces in the ballroom, the social standing she valued above her own blood, dissolving into dust right before her eyes. The humiliation was absolute. Kendra had been standing slightly behind Preston, frozen in shock, as the reality of my words washed over her. But as the silence in the ballroom stretched out, turning from shock into avid, hungry observation, Kendra realized the scene was turning incredibly ugly. Her husband was exposed. Her mother was paralyzed. The stolen money funding her lavish lifestyle was gone. Survival instinct kicked in. Kendra stepped forward abruptly. Her face was twisted into an expression of desperate panic. She lunged at me, grabbing my arm with sudden, surprising strength. Her manicured nails dug viciously through the fine silk of my crimson suit, biting into my skin. "Mom, get her in the kitchen!" Kendra hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained terror. "Now." Kendra's manicured nails dug into my forearm with frantic, terrifying strength. Her grip was entirely devoid of the elegant poise she had been projecting to the ballroom just seconds prior. She hauled me forward, her expensive perfume suddenly suffocating as she dragged me away from the stunned faces of the church elders. Vivian was right on our heels, using her body to block the sightline of the guests, herding us toward the heavy swinging oak doors that led to the estate's massive commercial chef's kitchen. The catering staff had been temporarily banished to the outdoor patio to prepare the dessert service. The kitchen was completely empty, a vast expanse of gleaming stainless steel, cold white marble, and absolute silence. The moment the heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, cutting off the lively jazz music and the murmurs of the Atlanta elite, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Vivian did not waste a single second. The sweet, syrupy Southern matriarch persona dissolved instantly, melting away, to reveal the venomous, resentful woman I had known my entire life. She spun around to face me, her perfectly manicured hands curled into fists at her sides, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are a sick, bitter, ugly disappointment," Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with a guttural rage that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. "You have spent your entire miserable life jealous of your sister. You could never stand that Kendra married a wealthy, successful, powerful man while you ended up with a financial parasite. And now, just because your own pathetic excuse for a marriage is falling apart, you concoct this absolute fantasy of a federal investigation to destroy her happiness." She took a step closer, her chest heaving, trying to physically dominate the space. "You are not a federal anything, Jasmine. You are a glorified calculator. You sit in a cubicle. You are going to march back out into that hallway. You are going to apologize to Preston in front of the pastor, and you are going to leave my house before I have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. You will not ruin Kendra's perfect life out of pure jealousy." I stood perfectly still, my back resting lightly against the cool edge of the marble island. I did not cross my arms. I did not avert my gaze. I looked at Vivian and then I looked at Kendra, observing the way they naturally formed a semicircle around me, trapping me against the counter. This was the exact dynamic of my childhood. This was the playbook they had perfected over 3 decades. Whenever Kendra failed, whenever Vivian felt insecure, they would back me into a literal corner. They would hurl insults, tear down my appearance, mock my intelligence, and relentlessly attack my self-worth until I broke. They wanted the tears. They wanted the desperate apologies. They wanted me to shrink so they could feel large. But today I was stone. I did not feel the familiar childhood sting of rejection. I felt nothing but the cold analytical thrill of an investigator watching a target unravel. Their anger was not power. It was pure, unfiltered terror. Kendra realized immediately that Vivian's intimidation tactics were failing. She saw the absolute dead calm in my eyes and panicked. Her survival instinct overrode her mother's blind rage. Kendra decided to switch tactics, deploying the good cop routine she utilized whenever she needed something she could not take by force. Kendra let out a dramatic, trembling sigh. Her eyes welled with perfectly timed crocodile tears spilling over her immaculate makeup. She reached out, attempting to place a comforting hand on my shoulder, but I simply shifted my weight, letting her hand fall to her side. "Jasmine, please," Kendra begged, her voice taking on a high, frantic pitch of manufactured sympathy. "We are family. We do not have to do this. Terrence is a good man. He just made a stupid, desperate mistake this morning because you work so much. You drove him to it. And Preston is under an immense amount of stress at the law firm. You are blowing a simple accounting error wildly out of proportion." She sniffled, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "Think about Malik, Jasmine. Think about your son. He needs stability. He does not need his mother dragging his father through a messy public divorce, and he certainly does not need his aunt and uncle targeted by some vindictive audit. We want to help you. We really do." I tilted my head, waiting for the inevitable transaction. Kendra never offered sympathy without a price tag. "We know Terrence froze your checking account." Kendra continued, her tone dropping into a conspiratorial whisper as if she were offering me a lifeline. "We know you have absolutely nothing left. You cannot afford to fight Preston. You cannot afford to fight Vivian. So let us make a deal. I will personally write you a check right now. $10,000. Cash. A clean, fresh start. All you have to do is drop this ridiculous audit fantasy sign, the voluntary physical custody papers giving Terrence temporary control of Malik, and walk away quietly. Take the money, Jasmine. It is more than you deserve after the scene you just caused. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the sheer staggering magnitude of her delusion. She was attempting to buy my silence, my career, and my 8-year-old son with a $10,000 pity payout. She truly believed I was a broken, destitute woman clinging to the edge of survival. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I looked down at my manicured nails, then back up at my sister. $10,000, I repeated, letting the number hang in the quiet kitchen. You and your husband have systematically embezzled over $2.4 million from your clients over the last 12 months. You bought that diamond tennis bracelet on your wrist with money stolen from a widow's settlement fund. And you think you can buy a federal forensic auditor for $10,000. Kendra's face drained of all color, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The fake tears dried up instantly. You are lying! Vivian shrieked, stepping forward again, her hands shaking violently. Preston makes millions. He does not need to steal. You are fabricating this because you are insane. I am not fabricating anything, Vivian, I said smoothly. I have the routing numbers. I have the shell company registration with your signature on it. Preston's firm is bleeding cash and his senior partners have scheduled an internal audit for next Friday. Preston knows the moment they open those escrow ledgers, he is going straight to federal prison and he is taking you right down with him. I took a step toward Kendra, closing the distance between us. The air in the kitchen felt incredibly thin. But the math did not make sense to me. At first I continued, my voice dropping to a conversational lethal pitch. Why the sudden rush to plant drugs in my house this morning? Why push an illegal ex parte order through the courts today? Why risk disbarment and federal charges to seize custody of Malik right now? I watched Kendra's throat swallow convulsively. Her eyes darted toward the swinging doors, searching for an escape that did not exist. Then I realized what Terrence has been hiding from me, I said. Terrence's father did not just leave him a gold watch when he passed away last year. He set up a generational wealth trust, a $500,000 trust fund that vests entirely to Malik. But as long as I am the primary custodial parent, Terrence cannot touch a single dime of that money. Kendra broke. The pressure of the impending audit, the realization that I knew every single detail of their crimes, and the terror of losing her wealthy lifestyle shattered her completely. Because we need that money, Kendra screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, guttural wail. We need Malik's trust fund. Preston's partners are going to look at the books next week. If we do not put the cash back into the escrow accounts by Monday morning, we lose everything. We lose the house, we lose the cars, Preston goes to jail. You have your stupid little career, Jasmine. You do not need that money. Terrence promised us Malik's trust fund to cover the deficit. All you had to do was go to jail for a few days, take the drug charge, and let Terrence have custody. It was a victimless solution. You are ruining my life. Her confession echoed off the stainless steel walls, a raw, undeniable admission of guilt. Vivian grabbed Kendra's arm, her eyes wide with absolute horror, violently shushing her daughter. But the damage was already done. The truth was out in the open, ugly and fully exposed. They had conspired to frame me for narcotics, strip me of my child, and drain an 8-year-old boy's inheritance, just to save Preston from the consequences of his own grand larceny. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out between us. I watched the realization of what Kendra had just confessed slowly settle into Vivian's eyes. I watched the arrogant matriarch finally understand that she was trapped. I raised my left hand, the crimson silk of my sleeve falling back to reveal the sleek, dark face of my smartwatch. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. I tapped the glowing red icon on the digital screen. Did you really think I would not wear a wire to a family brunch? I asked softly. All the blood instantly vanished from Kendra's face. Her knees buckled slightly, Vivian catching her by the elbow before she hit the marble floor. They stared at the watch, the tiny red recording light pulsing like a heartbeat, broadcasting their entire unhinged confession directly to a secure, encrypted federal server. The trap they had spent months building for me had just snapped shut around their own throats. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen remained shut, isolating us in a sudden, breathless vacuum. The district attorney's voice had clicked off, leaving only the hum of the massive sub-zero refrigerator. I picked up my burner phone, ended the call, and slipped it back into my leather tote. I did not say a word. I did not have to. Vivian's meticulously constructed reality was in a state of catastrophic freefall. The realization that federal agents were currently en route to her Buckhead estate ready to drag her out of her own high society brunch in handcuffs shattered her completely. The syrupy southern matriarch was dead. The desperate cornered criminal remained. She looked wildly around the kitchen, her eyes darting from the marble countertops to the stainless steel sinks, as if expecting a trapdoor to magically appear and swallow her whole. "No!" Vivian gasped, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her cream dress. "No, no, no, you cannot do this. You cannot do this to me. I am Vivian Carter. The pastor is in my living room. The mayor's wife is eating my quiche." She staggered toward me, her posture broken. "Jasmine, please. You have to call him back. You have to tell the district attorney it was a mistake. Tell him you fabricated the audio. Tell him I was just repeating a story Preston told me. I did not steal anything. I just signed the papers Preston put in front of me. He said it was a tax shelter." I watched her beg, feeling the ghost of the little girl she had constantly belittled rise and instantly vanish. She was trying to throw her beloved trophy son-in-law under the proverbial bus the second her own freedom was threatened. The unwavering loyalty she claimed to have for him extended only as far as her own comfort. "Ignorance is not a recognized legal defense for wire fraud, Vivian," I stated calmly, picking up my mimosa flute and taking a slow sip. "Especially when your signature is on the corporate registration for the shell company receiving the stolen funds. The federal government does not care if you thought it was a tax shelter. They care that $2.4 million of widows' pensions paid for your imported Italian marble fountain." Kendra, who had been completely silent since the DA's announcement, suddenly pushed off the refrigerator. She stumbled past Vivian, her eyes wide, frantic, and completely detached from reality. She dropped to her knees right in front of the kitchen island, her hands scrambling over the polished granite. She began frantically gathering the shredded pieces of the photograph she had just torn apart. She was trying to piece Preston's face back together, her breath hitching in ragged, terrifying sobs. "It's a mistake," Kendra muttered to herself, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the paper. "Preston loves me. He is a good man. He provides a legacy. He bought me this bracelet. He loves me." She looked up at me from the floor, her makeup completely ruined, her designer dress wrinkled and stained with tears. The arrogance that had defined her entire life was utterly obliterated. "Jasmine, you have to fix this," Kendra pleaded, her voice cracking. "Preston is going to go to jail. They are going to take the house. They are going to take the cars. How am I supposed to live? How am I supposed to show my face at the club?" "You have the money. You have $4 million offshore. You can pay back the trust fund. You can replace the stolen money before the FBI gets to the firm." I stared down at my sister. She was actually asking me to drain my own legally acquired patented royalties to cover the federal crimes of the man who had just tried to strip me of my child. The absolute towering audacity was breathtaking. "I am a federal investigator, Kendra," I replied, my voice hard and unyielding. "I do not finance domestic terrorism, and I certainly do not write checks to save men who plant narcotics in my home. You built your entire identity on Preston's wallet. Now you get to build your identity on his indictments." Vivian let out a sharp, panicked wail. She turned toward the swinging doors, her hand reaching for the brass handle. "I have to get him. I have to warn Preston. We have to leave before the sirens get here. We can go to the lake house. We can—" "If you open those doors and attempt to flee," I interrupted, my voice cracking like a whip, freezing her in place, "you will elevate this from a white-collar financial investigation to a federal manhunt. Flight implies profound guilt. You will guarantee a maximum sentence, and you will do it in front of every single elite socialite you have spent the last 30 years trying to impress. They will watch you run like a common criminal. Vivian pulled her hand back from the door as if the brass handle were coated in acid. She pressed her back against the heavy wood trapped between the kitchen and the ballroom, her chest heaving, as she realized there was absolutely nowhere left to run. At that exact moment, the heavy oak door swung open, hitting Vivian squarely in the back and knocking her stumbling forward. Terrence stepped into the kitchen. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed and slick with sweat. His tailored charcoal suit looked rumpled and his tie was slightly askew. He had clearly driven straight from the precinct, likely violating several traffic laws to get here. He looked from Vivian, who was hyperventilating against the counter, to Kendra, who was sitting on the floor sobbing over a shredded photograph, and finally to me, standing perfectly calm with a mimosa in my hand. "Jasmine!" Terrence gasped, his eyes darting around the room in absolute confusion. "What did you do?" "The bank called me. They said the ex parte freeze was federally overridden. They said my accounts are locked pending an investigation into unauthorized wire transfers. What is going on?" Before I could answer, the faint, unmistakable wail of police sirens drifted through the thick walls of the estate. The sound started low, a distant hum, but rapidly grew louder, sharper, and more insistent. It was not just one siren. It was a chorus of them converging on the property from multiple directions. Terrence's face went completely blank. He looked at me, the arrogance he had displayed in the interrogation room fully replaced by abject terror. "What did you do, Jasmine?" he asked again, his voice dropping to an incredibly small, frightened whisper. I set my crystal flute down on the granite island, the glass making a sharp final clink against the stone. I picked up my leather tote bag and secured the brass clasp. "I didn't do anything, Terrence," I said smoothly, stepping around him and heading toward the side exit of the kitchen that led directly to the catering driveway. "I just audited the family." I exited the catering driveway of my mother's Buckhead estate without a single backward glance. The humid Atlanta air felt remarkably lighter now, completely scrubbed clean of Vivian's suffocating floral perfume and Kendra's manufactured panic. I slid into the driver's seat of my sedan, the leather hot against my back, and steered my car away from the sprawling brick mansion. I did not drive toward my empty home. I did not drive to Tara's house to collect my son just yet. I had a final destination on my itinerary. I merged onto the interstate, pointing my car straight toward the gleaming, aggressive skyline of downtown Atlanta. Specifically, I was heading for Peachtree Street. The traffic was surprisingly light for a Sunday afternoon, allowing me to make excellent time. I navigated the familiar downtown grid with practiced ease, pulling into a parking structure located directly across the street from the towering glass and steel structure that housed Preston's prestigious corporate law firm. I found a spot on the second level that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the firm's main entrance. I killed the engine, rolled down the window just an inch to let the city sounds filter in, and rested my hands on the steering wheel. The building across the street was an architectural monument to power, wealth, and systemic intimidation. I knew this building intimately. I knew the exact layout of the marble lobby and the specific cut of the security desk. Just 6 months ago, during the preliminary stages of my separation, Terrence had dragged me into one of those top-floor corner suites. He had orchestrated an ambush under the guise of a civil mediation. Preston had sat behind his massive mahogany desk, steepling his fingers while his senior partners hovered in the background like impeccably dressed vultures. Preston had used this very room, this very firm, as a bludgeon. He had leaned across the polished wood, his blue eyes cold and unyielding, and explicitly threatened to out-litigate me. He promised to bury me in so much corporate paperwork, frivolous motions, and endless discovery requests that I would be paying legal fees until I was 90 years old. He promised to use his partners to bleed me dry if I did not capitulate to every single one of Terrence's outrageous financial demands. He relied on the weight of that glass tower to make me feel small, uneducated, and entirely outmatched. He assumed the standard playbook of corporate intimidation would break a black woman who, in his mind, merely audited standard spreadsheets for a living. He looked at me and saw someone who lacked the pedigree to fight back. I sat in my car, now perfectly still, and stared up at that exact same corner office. The afternoon sun hit the glass, reflecting a blindingly bright light. I did not feel small today. I felt like the architect of their absolute destruction. Right on schedule, a fleet of unmarked black SUVs violently boxed in the front entrance of the high-rise. The screeching of heavy tires echoed loudly across the concrete plaza. The doors flew open simultaneously. Heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and Navy windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI swarmed the perimeter. They moved with absolute devastating precision. 2 agents immediately secured the revolving glass doors, while a dozen more flooded into the grand marble lobby. From my vantage point across the street, the visual was spectacularly satisfying. The haughty, untouchable senior partners who had stood behind Preston and threatened my livelihood were currently being lined up against the lobby security desk. I watched through the floor-to-ceiling glass as agents confiscated expensive leather briefcases, seized hard drives, and locked down the executive elevators. The firm's ironclad reputation, built over decades of ruthless corporate maneuvering, was being dismantled in broad daylight. Local news vans, alerted by the sudden influx of federal vehicles on police scanners, began screeching to a halt along Peachtree Street. Cameramen hoisted their heavy equipment onto their shoulders, sprinting toward the police barricades forming around the building. Reporters adjusted their microphones, speaking frantically into cameras as the scene unfolded. They did not have to wait long for the main event. The glass doors parted. Preston was practically dragged out onto the concrete plaza by 2 imposing federal agents. He was stripped of his suit jacket, his expensive silk tie loosened and hanging crookedly around his neck. His hands were secured firmly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The arrogant, high-powered attorney who had just threatened to destroy me at a Sunday brunch was now doing a highly televised perp walk. The flashbulbs from the press cameras strobed relentlessly, capturing every single angle of his humiliation. Preston kept his head down, trying desperately to shield his face from the unforgiving lenses, but the damage was irreversible. His career, his firm, and his meticulously crafted facade of white-collar invincibility were dead. I watched him being shoved into the back of a black SUV, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that brought a slow, genuine smile to my face. My primary phone began vibrating violently in the cup holder of my center console. The group chats were detonating. I unlocked the screen and watched the notifications flood in like a digital avalanche. Vivian's social embarrassment was instantaneous and catastrophic. Atlanta's elite circles run on information, and gossip moves faster than a fiber-optic network. The church elders, the city council members, and the local judges, who were currently drinking mimosas in my mother's ballroom, were receiving the exact same breaking news alerts I was watching live. They were standing in a house funded by the embezzled money of the man currently on their smartphone screens in handcuffs. I watched the incoming texts from my cousin, who had managed to stay out of the kitchen during my confrontation. She described absolute pandemonium. Vivian's phone was blowing up with calls from the very people standing in her own living room. Guests were demanding explanations, quietly distancing themselves from the catering tables and rushing aggressively for the valet line. The perfectly curated, devout, wealthy family image had shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. Vivian was experiencing a social death so absolute she would never recover. She would never host another brunch. She would never sit in the front pew of her church with her head held high. The community she worshipped, the elite society she had sacrificed her own daughter to be a part of, was currently abandoning her en masse. She was entirely exposed. The narrative she had spun for 35 years, claiming I was the difficult, unstable disappointment of the family, evaporated in the face of federal indictments. I took a deep, cleansing breath, savoring the cool air conditioning circulating inside my car. The meticulous offshore financial planning, the tracing of the metadata, the silent endurance of their insults, and the steadfast commitment to my own professional brilliance had all culminated in this precise moment of justice. I reached over to grab my leather bag, preparing to put my car in gear. It was time to finally go collect my son from Tara and start our new life. Then my secondary burner phone rang. The sharp synthetic ringtone cut through the quiet interior of my car, startling me. I stared at the device resting on the passenger seat. I had only given this specific encrypted number to David and my private legal team. No one else possessed the routing digits. I picked it up expecting David to deliver the final confirmation regarding the seizure of the offshore shell accounts. I pressed the green button and accepted the call, holding the device to my ear. "Jazz, I need to see Malik." It was Terrence. His voice was completely frantic, lacking any of the smooth, polished arrogance he had displayed in the precinct interrogation room just hours prior. He was breathing heavily, the sound crackling harshly through the cheap speaker of the burner phone. He sounded like a man who was actively running. "Please," Terrence begged, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate edge that sent a sudden spike of adrenaline straight through my chest. "I am at his school right now." I gripped the steering wheel, the leather groaning under the sudden pressure of my hands. I did not hang up the burner phone immediately. I let the silence stretch across the cellular connection, allowing Terrence to hear his own ragged, panicked breathing echoing back at him. "Are you listening to me?" Terrence shouted, his voice cracking into a high, desperate register. "The bank teller told me a federal hold was placed on my routing numbers. They locked me out of the joint accounts. They locked me out of my personal accounts. I came to the academy to pick up Malik from his weekend robotics workshop, but the security guards will not let me through the lobby doors. They said my physical custody mandate was flagged as fraudulent in the state database." "What did you do?" "I am 5 minutes away, Terrence," I stated, my voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Do not move. Do not make a scene. If you frighten my son, I will make sure the federal marshals process you before the sun goes down." I ended the call and tossed the burner phone onto the passenger seat. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, merging aggressively out of the downtown parking structure and tearing onto the streets leading toward Malik's private preparatory academy. My mind was a hyper-focused grid of timelines and legal contingencies. Terrence was a cornered animal. With his bank accounts federally frozen and the ex parte custody order invalidated by the swift intervention of my legal team, he had realized his entire extortion plot was disintegrating. He was trying to physically secure Malik as a final desperate bargaining chip. He was too cowardly to face me empty-handed. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the elite private academy. The weekend campus was usually a sanctuary of manicured lawns, quiet brick buildings, and hushed privilege. Today, it was the stage for Terrence's absolute unraveling. I parked my sedan haphazardly across 2 visitor spaces near the main administrative building. I stepped out of the car, my heels crunching sharply against the asphalt, and immediately spotted him. Terrence was standing outside the heavy reinforced glass doors of the academy's front office. He was pounding the heel of his hand against the shatterproof glass, shouting incomprehensibly at the terrified administrative assistant locked safely inside. 2 campus security guards were actively flanking him, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, ordering him to step back from the entrance. Terrence looked feral. His suit jacket was discarded on the pavement, his silk tie ripped away, and his dress shirt soaked in sweat. He was a man who had built his entire life on the illusion of control, and that illusion had just been violently stripped away. "Terrence," I called out, my voice slicing cleanly through the humid afternoon air. He spun around. The wild, frantic energy radiating from him faltered the second he saw me standing in the parking lot. He looked at my custom crimson suit entirely unruffled and the cold, assessing stare I pinned him with. He took a stumbling step away from the glass doors, waving off the security guards who immediately recognized me and relaxed their defensive postures. I gave the head guard a brief acknowledging nod, silently confirming that I had the situation completely contained. "Jasmine." Terrence gasped, closing the distance between us, but instinctively stopping 3 feet away, halted by the sheer force of my composure. "You have to call the bank. You have to call your lawyers. They are making a mistake." I went to the ATM and the screen said, "Contact federal authorities." I came here to get Malik so we could sit down and talk about this like a family, but they treated me like a criminal. They locked the doors on me. I crossed my arms, looking at the pathetic, sweat-drenched man standing before me. He was still trying to spin the narrative. He was still trying to play the victim, instinctively retreating into the exact same manipulative playbook he had utilized for our entire 10-year marriage. "There is no mistake, Terrence," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "The federal hold is accurate. The invalidation of your fraudulent custody order is accurate. You conspired with Preston to plant narcotics in my home this morning. You conspired to strip me of my child to gain access to Malik's generational trust fund. You did this to cover Preston's massive embezzlement deficit because you are a financial parasite who hitched your wagon to a sinking ship." Terrence physically recoiled. His eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing as he desperately searched for a lie that could save him. When he realized I possessed every single piece of the puzzle, his face contorted into a mask of righteous indignation. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You forced my hand," he shouted, his voice echoing across the empty parking lot. "You stopped paying my credit cards, Jasmine. You froze me out of the household budget. My logistics startup was struggling because the market is terrible right now. It was not my fault the investors pulled out. I had suppliers threatening to sue me. Preston offered me a lifeline. He said if I helped him secure temporary custody of Malik, he would give me a cut of the trust fund to save my business. I was doing it for us. I was doing it to build a legacy for our family. You were holding me back." I stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute freezing disgust wash over me. I had spent a decade absorbing this exact rhetoric. I had spent 10 years working 80-hour weeks, auditing complex corporate ledgers, and building my own patented financial algorithms just to keep our household afloat. I had paid the mortgage every single time he quit a job because his boss did not recognize his supposed genius. I had drained my own savings to cover the debts he accrued from his endless string of failed catastrophic business ventures. "Do not ever use the word legacy in my presence again," I replied, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with an icy authority that made him flinch. "You have never built a single thing in your miserable life. You blame the market for your failed startup just like you blamed your partners when your restaurant franchise collapsed in 2022. You blamed the economy when you defaulted on the commercial real estate loans in 2019. It is always someone else's fault. You are a professional victim, Terrence. You spent 10 years treating my bank account like an endless ATM to fund your delusions of grandeur. And the second I finally cut you off, you resorted to a felony conspiracy against the mother of your child." His anger evaporated instantly, replaced by the crushing reality of his situation. He looked down at his trembling hands, the realization finally breaking through his thick skull. His wealthy brother-in-law was gone. His access to my money was gone. His fraudulent custody play had failed spectacularly. He was completely, utterly isolated. Terrence's knees suddenly buckled. He collapsed onto the rough asphalt of the school parking lot, the sharp gravel biting into the expensive fabric of his suit pants. He let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying his face in his hands. It was a spectacular display of manufactured grief. He was weeping not out of remorse for what he had done to me, but out of pure terror for the consequences he was about to face. "We can fix this, Jazz," Terrence wailed, looking up at me from the ground. Tears and sweat streamed down his face, completely ruining his carefully groomed appearance. "Please, I am begging you. We can go back to counseling. I will drop the divorce. I will do whatever you want. It was not even my idea. It was your mother." He grasped desperately at the air, trying to deflect the blame onto anyone else. "Vivian made me do it!" he cried, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "Vivian knew I was broke. She called me. She told me Preston was in trouble with the firm's trust accounts. She orchestrated the entire thing. She said if I called the police on you and took Malik, the family court would immediately grant me access to the $500,000 trust. She manipulated me, Jasmine. I was just trying to provide for us. I was trying to be the man you wanted me to be. Please do not take my son away from me. Do not let the federal agents arrest me." I looked down at the man kneeling on the asphalt. I did not reach out to help him up. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I felt nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness where my affection for him used to reside. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man, willing to sell his own son's future and destroy his wife's freedom just to maintain a fragile illusion of success. I slowly unclasped the heavy brass buckle of my leather tote bag. I reached inside, bypassing the encrypted burner phones and the offshore banking ledgers. My fingers found the thick, heavily sealed manila envelope waiting at the bottom. I pulled it out and held it by the corner, extending my arm to hand it down to him. Terrence stopped crying. He looked at the envelope, his tear-filled eyes blinking in rapid succession. He slowly reached up with a trembling hand and took the heavy package from my grasp. He stared at the blank cover, terrified to open it. "These are the divorce papers, Terrence," I say coldly, "and a civil suit for the $45,000 you drained from our joint account." Terrence stared at the thick manila envelope resting in his trembling hands. For several long, agonizing seconds, he remained kneeling on the hot asphalt of the academy parking lot. He waited for me to break. He waited for the familiar, predictable script of our marriage to play out just as it always had. For 10 years, his tears had been the ultimate currency in our household. Whenever he gambled away our savings on a terrible investment, whenever he ruined another business venture, through sheer incompetence, he would cry. He would drop to his knees, burying his face in his hands, and I would inevitably step in to fix the catastrophic damage he had caused. He expected me to soften. He expected me to reach down, pull him to his feet, and tell him we would figure it out together. I did not move a single muscle. I stood over him, my shadow casting a dark, sharp silhouette across his tear-stained face, and I simply watched him. The silence stretched heavy and unforgiving in the humid afternoon air. Slowly, the realization washed over him. The performance was failing. The manipulation was completely ineffective. I watched the manufactured grief drain from his eyes, instantly replaced by a dark, toxic resentment. The pathetic weeping victim vanished entirely. Terrence scrambled to his feet, his expensive dress shoes scraping harshly against the gravel. He brushed the dust from his ruined suit pants, his spine stiffening as he tried desperately to reclaim his stolen authority. His face twisted into an ugly, familiar sneer, his upper lip curling with pure disdain. The mask was officially off. The abusive, arrogant man I had spent a decade making excuses for was finally standing in the broad daylight, stripped of his pathetic excuses. He did not look like a man whose entire extortion plot had just collapsed. He looked like a predator who had found his favorite weapon. He lunged forward and violently shoved the heavy manila envelope directly back into my chest. I caught it reflexively, taking a half-step backward to absorb the impact, but my expression never shifted. "You actually think a stack of printed paper is going to stop me?" Terrence spat, his voice dropping into a vicious, menacing register that vibrated with hostility. "You think you can just hand me a lawsuit and walk away from this marriage with my son? You are out of your mind, Jasmine." He began pacing back and forth in front of my car, his hands gesturing wildly as he built his imaginary courtroom defense. "You have always thought you were so much smarter than me just because you wear a custom suit and look at financial spreadsheets all day. But you are a terrible mother. You are a cold, unfeeling career woman who cares more about federal audits and corporate ladder climbing than her own flesh and blood." That is the exact narrative I am going to paint in family court. I watched him rant, feeling the ghost of 1,000 past arguments wash over me. For 10 years, I had absorbed this exact rhetoric. Terrence had weaponized my ambition, twisting my grueling 80-hour work weeks into a profound moral failing. Whenever his businesses went under, it was never his lack of discipline. It was because I did not support him enough. Whenever he failed to pay the electric bill, it was my fault for emasculating him by earning a higher salary. He had used my necessary absence as a bludgeon, painting himself as the devoted, neglected patriarch while I slaved away to keep a roof over our heads. He always played the victim, and now he was planning to take that act to a judge. "I am going to stand in front of a magistrate and detail every single bedtime you missed because you were stuck at the office." Terrence roared, his face turning a blotchy red as his confidence artificially inflated. "I am going to pull your timesheets. I am going to subpoena your firm. I will show the court exactly how many weekends you spent locked in your home office building your little algorithms while I was the one actually raising Malik. You hired a nanny because you could not be bothered to be a real mother. He stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. I will drag your name through the absolute thickest mud in the Georgia family court system. I will make you look like a sterile, heartless corporate machine. No judge in this state will give you full physical custody once I am finished testifying. They will look at your insane working hours, they will look at my devotion, and they will hand Malik directly to me. Terrence took a deep breath, his chest puffing out as he delivered what he believed to be his final crushing blow. And once I have primary custody, the trust fund automatically activates. But I am not stopping there, Jas. Not after this stunt today. You want to sue me for $45,000? Fine. I will countersue for spousal support. I will demand half of everything you own. And I know about the offshore money, Jasmine. Kendra told me everything. I know about your hidden accounts and your patented royalties. I will hire a forensic accountant of my own to rip through your secret safety nets. I will take Malik, I will take the house, and I will take every single dime of that offshore money you think you have hidden away. I will bleed you completely dry until you are the one begging on your knees. He stood there breathing heavily, looking incredibly proud of his legal strategy. He truly believed he had backed me into an unwinnable corner, wielding the family court system like an executioner's axe. He thought his sheer audacity would finally break my composure. I looked at him. I did not feel a shred of anger. I did not feel the familiar suffocating guilt he had spent a decade conditioning me to feel. I felt nothing but a cool, refreshing wave of absolute finality. I slowly lowered the manila envelope, letting my arm rest casually at my side. I turned my back to him entirely and walked the 2 short steps to the driver's side door of my sedan. I reached out and pressed my thumb against the handle. The car unlocked with a sharp electronic beep that echoed loudly in the quiet parking lot. I opened the heavy door, resting my hand on the top frame, and finally turned back to look at the man who had just threatened to ruin my existence. "You can try," I said softly, my voice perfectly level and entirely unbothered. The utter lack of fear in my tone made Terrence freeze. His triumphant sneer faltered, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He had fired his best shot, and I had barely blinked. "But before you file those ridiculous countersuits, you should probably check your email, Terrence." I watched his eyes narrow in suspicion. He instinctively reached into his tailored slacks, his fingers grazing his smartphone, but he did not pull it out. He kept his eyes locked on mine, waiting for the trap to spring. "You see, when Vivian dropped off that bag of narcotics at my house this morning, she made a very critical error," I explained, leaning casually against the open door of my car. "Vivian is incredibly arrogant, but she is also fiercely dedicated to her own self-preservation. She wore leather driving gloves when she placed the bag under my bathroom sink. She wiped down the plastic seal. She ensured there was absolutely no physical evidence tying her directly to the contraband. She is a woman who has spent 35 years hiding her dirty work behind a pristine facade." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, watching the color slowly begin to drain from Terrence's face. "But you are not careful, Terrence," I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal, precise whisper. "You have always been spectacularly sloppy. You could not even manage a simple logistics startup without running it into the ground. What made you think you could successfully execute a felony narcotics frame-up? You were the one who sourced the drugs. You were the one who handled the glass pipe before handing the package off to my mother to plant." Terrence swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. "When I called the police this morning, I did not just hand over the bag of drugs to the responding officers. I handed over a pristine, uncontaminated chain of custody. The local precinct just finished dusting the evidence. Your fingerprints are all over the glass pipe, Terrence. The forensic match was confirmed exactly 20 minutes ago." I saw his chest completely stop moving. He was no longer breathing. The phone in his pocket suddenly vibrated, a harsh buzzing sound that made him physically jump. The automated email notification from the local precinct had just hit his inbox, alerting his legal counsel of the pending charges. "There is a felony warrant out for your arrest right now," I stated, my voice carrying the absolute crushing weight of a judge reading a final sentence. Terrence spun around, his eyes wide with a blind, animalistic panic. He looked toward the wrought iron gates of the academy, desperate to find an exit, desperate to run, just as he always had. But he was entirely too late. The heavy roar of high-performance engines shattered the quiet afternoon. Just as Terrence turned toward the street, two marked police cruisers jumped the curb, their tires screaming against the concrete as they boxed him violently into the parking lot. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted Terrence's horrified face in sharp, frantic strokes. I did not stay to watch the officers push him against the hood of the car. I did not stay to hear him read his Miranda rights, nor did I linger to listen to his desperate, pathetic screams echoing across the private academy's pristine parking lot. I simply put my sedan in drive, rolled up my window to block out the noise, and merged back onto the main road. He had spent 10 years building his own customized cage. I had merely handed the authorities the padlock. 2 weeks passed. The fallout from that Sunday was a seismic event that fractured the very bedrock of Atlanta's elite circles. Preston was out on a highly restrictive federal bail, his passports confiscated, his bank accounts frozen, and his law license indefinitely suspended, pending a massive criminal trial. He was currently confined to his home, drowning in the reality that he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Terrence, meanwhile, was sitting in a county holding cell. The magistrate had set an astronomically high bond for the felony narcotics conspiracy, a bond Terrence could not afford because I had legally and surgically severed his access to every single dime of our marital funds. Kendra was locked inside her sprawling estate, dodging process servers and ignoring the relentless knocking of local reporters. Yet amidst the absolute smoking ruins of her family's criminal conspiracy, Vivian operated in a state of sheer, terrifying denial. In my mother's mind, reality was entirely pliable as long as you threw enough imported silk and expensive champagne at it. She truly believed that social dominance could cure legal catastrophe. Tonight was her annual Women of Excellence charity gala. It was a highly publicized, incredibly opulent event, held in the grand ballroom of the Beaumont, one of downtown Atlanta's most historic and exclusive luxury hotels. Vivian had chaired the committee for a decade. Any rational human being whose son-in-law was facing federal embezzlement charges, and whose other son-in-law was in jail for planting narcotics, would step down. They would issue a polite statement citing personal family matters and retreat into the shadows to handle the crisis. Vivian doubled down. She refused to cancel. She refused to step back. She believed that if she forced the city's political and social elite to eat her catered caviar bid on her curated silent auction items and applaud her philanthropic efforts, the ugly truths plastered across the local news networks would simply vanish into the ether. I sat in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of my home office, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair. The surface of my mahogany desk was clean, save for my encrypted smartphone and a steaming cup of black coffee. My large, curved monitor was split perfectly down the middle. On the left side of the screen, endless rows of complex financial data, property deeds, and corporate routing numbers scrolled silently. On the right side of the screen, I was watching the high-definition live stream of the gala preparations, broadcast directly from the Beaumont's grand ballroom. Vivian had spared absolutely no expense to overcompensate for the scandals. The ballroom was draped in yards of cascading white orchids and shimmering gold fabric. Waiters in crisp tuxedos were already setting up towering champagne pyramids. And through the grapevine of event planners and private security contractors, I knew exactly what Vivian had done to ensure her night went flawlessly. She had explicitly banned me from the venue. She had printed a high-resolution photograph of my face and distributed it to the private security guards stationed at every entrance loading dock and service elevator. She had categorized her own daughter as a hostile threat to be removed on sight. But the ban was not her only weapon. She was actively utilizing the gala's pre-event networking to aggressively control the narrative. I watched the live feed as she glided gracefully between tables of wealthy donors and early arrivals wearing a dazzling custom-beaded sapphire gown. She was playing the role of the tragically betrayed, deeply faithful matriarch to absolute perfection. I turned up the volume on the live feed, listening intently as she leaned close to a local news anchor who was covering the red carpet arrivals. "It has been a trying season for our family, naturally," Vivian said, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "My eldest daughter, Jasmine, has unfortunately lost her way. The immense pressure of her corporate career simply broke her mind. We are devastated." Her jealousy over her sister's beautiful marriage, combined with the stress of her own impending divorce, drove her to fabricate these horrific, baseless lies to the authorities. "She is unwell. We are praying for her recovery, but tonight is about focusing on the positive, on the women who build our community up rather than tear it down." I watched her smile bravely for the camera, flawlessly painting me as a bitter, unstable, vindictive villain who had betrayed her own blood out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. She was standing in a room full of powerful people, building a fortress of public opinion to keep me out and protect her fragile ego. She failed to realize that I did not need an invitation to enter a building I was about to own. I muted the live stream, the silence washing back over my office. I picked up the heavy encrypted phone resting on my desk. I did not call a crisis public relations firm to counter her vicious lies. I did not call the local police to complain about defamation. I simply dialed the direct, heavily secured international line of my proxy holding firm in Geneva. The line rang twice before clicking over to a secure connection. "Ms. Wilson," my lead broker said, his voice crisp, efficient, and entirely professional. "We have finalized the exhaustive due diligence on the Beaumont Hospitality Group. The corporate ownership conglomerate is currently carrying $42 million in high-interest mezzanine debt. They over-leveraged their assets during the recent renovations and are currently on the verge of a catastrophic default. The primary creditors are highly motivated to offload the toxic debt immediately." I glanced back at the monitor. Vivian was currently clinking a crystal champagne flute with a state senator, her smile bright and completely hollow. She thought true power was determined by the designer label on your dress and the guest list at your parties. She had absolutely no concept of structural institutional leverage. "Execute the purchase," I instructed, my voice flat, cold, and echoing with absolute finality. I did not just buy a VIP ticket to her charity gala. I authorized a multi-million-dollar hostile buyout using the heavily diversified, legally untraceable yields from my offshore tech patents. I was purchasing the entirety of the crippling debt held by the venue's ownership group, restructuring it instantaneously through my anonymous shell corporation, and acquiring the controlling majority interest in the physical property itself. "Consider it done, Ms. Wilson," the broker replied without a trace of hesitation. "The wire transfers are clearing the international protocols now. The holding company will initiate the debt assumption protocols immediately. The property deeds, the operational management rights, and the absolute controlling interest of the Beaumont Hotel will officially transfer to your corporate entity by close of business today. Ensure the current hotel management team is notified of the ownership change the exact second the transfer clears," I added smoothly, "and inform them that the new primary stakeholder will be arriving for a comprehensive on-site inspection this evening." "Understood. We will finalize the paperwork." I hung up the phone and placed it gently back onto the mahogany desk. I looked at the digital clock displayed in the corner of my monitor. It was currently 6 o'clock in the evening. The Women of Excellence Gala was officially scheduled to begin its primary program in 2 hours. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the front of my tailored black trousers. I did not feel the need to wear a gown. I was not attending a party. I was conducting a hostile corporate takeover. By 8 o'clock tonight, I would not just be a banned, unwanted guest standing on the sidewalk. I would be the absolute, undisputed owner of the ground my mother was currently standing on. I leaned back against the plush cream leather seats of the chauffeured Maybach, allowing the ambient silence of the heavily armored vehicle to settle my pulse. The tinted windows turned the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta into a rapid blur of neon and gold, isolating me completely from the chaotic energy of the city streets. I unlocked my encrypted smartphone one last time. A brief text message from my best friend Tara confirmed that the primary objective was secure. Malik was bathed, fed, and currently fast asleep in her guest bedroom, after an exhaustive marathon session of building his new robotics kit. He was entirely safe, thoroughly insulated from the toxic, catastrophic fallout of the empire I was actively dismantling. I locked the screen and slipped the heavy device into my clutch. My son was protected. Tonight was exclusively about Vivian. I looked down at my reflection in the darkened window glass. I was wearing a custom-made floor-length emerald silk gown. The heavy fabric clung to my frame with absolute architectural precision, the rich jewel tone contrasting spectacularly against my dark skin. The deep plunging neckline and the aggressive high thigh slit were bold, unapologetic, and fiercely glamorous. For 35 years, Vivian had meticulously policed my wardrobe with an iron fist. She had forced me into muted navies, shapeless beige cardigans, and highly conservative, unmemorable cuts. Her explicit lifelong goal was to ensure I blended seamlessly into the wallpaper, fading entirely into the background, so my sister Kendra could perpetually command the center stage. Vivian had mandated that I remain the plain, serious, invisible sister, a convenient prop to contrast against Kendra's manufactured brilliance. I had spent a lifetime shrinking myself to make them comfortable. Tonight, I was the absolute epicenter of gravity, and I was going to ensure they choked on the spectacle. The Maybach glided to a remarkably smooth halt in front of the grand illuminated entrance of the Beaumont Hotel. The valet rushed forward, pulling the heavy door open with practiced urgency. I stepped out onto the concrete plaza, my diamond-encrusted stilettos flashing dangerously under the brilliant marquee lights. The reaction from the street was instantaneous and explosive. A massive swarm of local paparazzi and society photographers, initially gathered to capture Vivian's tragic matriarch routine, immediately pivoted their heavy lenses toward me. The rapid-fire strobes illuminated the humid night air, temporarily blinding, while reporters began screaming rapid-fire questions over the barricades. They demanded statements about Terrence's felony drug arrest. They yelled questions about Preston's suspended law license and his impending federal embezzlement trial. I did not break my stride. I kept my chin elevated, my posture flawless, and my expression an unreadable mask of absolute terrifying power. I ignored the screaming press and swept gracefully up the velvet-lined stairs toward the main lobby. The heavy brass doors were hauled open by the hotel's bell staff, granting me access to the sprawling marble-floored interior. The elegant sound of a live classical string quartet echoed softly from the mezzanine level, above an absurdly peaceful contrast to the financial violence I had just executed from my home office. Directly ahead of me stood the primary security checkpoint for the Women of Excellence Gala. 4 burly private security contractors stood behind a thick velvet rope, their hands resting cautiously near their belts, holding illuminated clipboards and communication radios. I knew exactly what was pinned to the top of those clipboards. Vivian had printed a high-resolution headshot of my face and explicitly instructed the entire security apparatus to treat me as a hostile, highly dangerous trespasser. She had ordered them to remove me with physical prejudice the second I stepped foot inside the lobby. I walked directly toward the head of security, a tall, imposing man with a coiled earpiece. As I approached, I watched his eyes dart aggressively from my face down to his clipboard. Recognition flared in his pupils. His jaw tightened, and his hand instinctively reached up to press the radio at his shoulder. He drew a breath, preparing to issue the command to have his men physically restrain and eject me from the premises. Before he could speak a single word, the general manager of the Beaumont Hotel, a frantic sweating man in a bespoke tuxedo, sprinted across the lobby marble and violently grabbed the security guard's wrist. The manager yanked the guard backward, his face pale with absolute, unadulterated terror. He whispered frantically into the guard's ear, pointing a trembling finger toward me. The guard's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. The color drained from his face as he looked back at me, no longer seeing a band, estranged daughter attempting to crash a charity event. He was looking at the new majority stakeholder of the entire building. He was looking at the woman who literally owned the concrete beneath his boots and who currently paid his contracting firm's invoice. The hotel manager stepped back completely terrified and bowed his head in deep, silent submission. The security guard swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he unclipped the velvet rope and stepped entirely out of my way, clearing the path with rapid urgency. I did not offer them a single glance of acknowledgement. I swept past the dismantled security desk, my emerald silk train gliding silently across the polished marble floor. I bypassed the crowded cocktail reception area and walked straight toward the heavy gold-leaf double doors of the grand ballroom. I placed my hands flat against the wood and pushed them open. The sheer overwhelming scale of Vivian's desperate overcompensation hit me immediately. The cavernous room was a suffocating display of hanging white orchids, glittering crystal chandeliers, and hundreds of Atlanta's most influential political and social figures sitting at perfectly arranged banquet tables. Waiters moved silently through the aisles, pouring vintage champagne into expensive crystal flutes. And there, standing under a massive blinding spotlight on the main stage, was my mother. Vivian was wearing a heavily beaded sapphire gown, gripping the podium microphone with both hands to steady her dramatic performance. Her face was projected in high definition onto two massive digital screens flanking the stage. She was mid-monologue, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated manufactured sorrow. "We are gathered tonight to celebrate resilience and sisterhood," Vivian told the captivated, silent crowd, delicately dabbing the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief. "But resilience is often born from profound personal tragedy. Our family is currently navigating a dark, incredibly difficult season. We are under spiritual attack by a troubled, estranged daughter." A collective murmur of sympathetic gasps rippled through the wealthy audience. Vivian absorbed the pity feeding on the room's energy to fuel her lies. "She has chosen a path of vindictive destruction," Vivian continued, her voice breaking beautifully for the cameras. "She has turned her back on the very family that nurtured her, fabricating terrible falsehoods to hide her own personal failings. We pray for her shattered mind every single day, but tonight we must focus on the light." I stood at the back of the room, hidden briefly in the deep shadows of the heavy entrance archway, listening to her publicly assassinate my character to save her own skin. She was actively using my name as a human shield to distract the city from Terrence's felony drug charges and Preston's massive federal indictments. She was selling a brilliant, ruthless story of a heartbroken mother suffering at the hands of a sociopathic, jealous child. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking straight down the center aisle. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of my heels, but the visual impact of the vibrant emerald gown cutting through the sea of black tuxedos was impossible to ignore. I moved with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying grace of a predator who had already locked the doors from the inside. Heads began to turn. Conversations at the tables closest to the center aisle died instantly. The wealthy guests recognized the woman Vivian was currently weeping about, standing right in their midst, looking fiercely composed, devastatingly wealthy, and entirely unapologetic. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage, then Kendra spotted me. My sister was sitting at the primary VIP table, located directly at the foot of the stage, surrounded by local politicians and elite socialites. She had a glass of expensive champagne, lifted halfway to her lips, nodding along sympathetically to our mother's speech. When her eyes shifted and landed on my emerald gown, the color completely vanished from her perfectly contoured face. Her hand spasmed violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her paralyzed fingers, shattering loudly against the pristine white tablecloth. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking glass echoed harshly through the front half of the ballroom, drawing Vivian's attention away from her teleprompter. Kendra ignored the spilled wine soaking rapidly into her expensive designer dress. She leapt from her chair, her eyes wide with frantic, uncontainable panic, and began aggressively waving her arms at the two massive stage security guards stationed at the base of the stairs. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, frantically mouthing the words to throw me out immediately. The two large guards, who were hired privately by Vivian's specific event committee and were entirely unaware of the massive corporate ownership transfer that had occurred hours prior, immediately stepped off the stage perimeter. They cracked their knuckles and began marching aggressively down the center aisle toward me. Their faces were set in grim, authoritative lines, their heavy hands reaching out to physically restrain my arms and drag me out of the ballroom in front of the entire city. I did not flinch. I did not break my stride. I did not even look at the two men barreling toward me. I kept my gaze locked dead center on my mother's terrified pale face projected on the digital screens. I casually raised my right hand, lifting two fingers into the air. It was the precise signal I had established with the head event coordinator I had personally briefed via encrypted email just 10 minutes ago, who was currently sitting inside the elevated glass-enclosed sound booth at the back of the room. The sweeping orchestral music cut out instantly. The bright, flattering stage spotlights snapped off with a loud mechanical thud. A heavy, jarring electronic squeal ripped aggressively through the ballroom speakers, causing several guests to cover their ears. Then the entire lighting rig shifted, turning the stage a harsh, unforgiving, blinding shade of crimson red. Vivian tapped her microphone frantically, her mouth moving rapidly as she tried desperately to maintain her tearful monologue, but the audio feed was completely dead. The silence that descended upon the grand ballroom was not just quiet, it was a physical, suffocating weight. The sudden absence of the sweeping orchestral music and the harsh shift to the crimson emergency lighting completely shattered the carefully curated illusion of the evening. The hundreds of influential guests, politicians and socialites sat frozen in their gilded chairs, their expensive champagne flutes suspended in midair. They stared at the stage in absolute shock. I did not stop walking. I took my next step, the sharp, deliberate click of my diamond-encrusted stiletto, ringing out like a gunshot in the cavernous room. The heavy emerald silk of my custom gown brushed against the edges of the pristine white tablecloths as I moved with unhurried, predatory grace down the center aisle. The murmurs of Atlanta's elite died down entirely. The sea of wealthy donors parted instinctively, pulling their chairs forward to clear my path, their eyes tracking my every movement. I recognized the faces staring back at me. There was Senator Hayes sitting 3 tables away, a man Vivian had shamelessly lobbied and flattered for 6 consecutive months just to secure his attendance tonight. There was Judge Carmichael, a prominent figure on the state appellate bench, looking entirely bewildered. There were the wives of the city's top real estate developers, the philanthropic board members, and the charity executives. These were the architects of Atlanta high society. These were the exact people Vivian catered to her entire life. They were the ultimate judges of her worth. For 35 years she had sacrificed my childhood, my self-esteem and my autonomy simply to secure a precarious seat at their table. She had spent decades forcing me to shrink, to hide my brilliance, and to absorb the role of the troubled, difficult child so she could play the saintly, suffering matriarch in front of this specific audience. Tonight, I was going to tear off her mask in front of every single one of them. I reached the base of the carpeted stairs leading up to the main platform. The 2 massive private security guards who had previously marched down the aisle to remove me were now standing awkwardly to the side, their hands clasped firmly behind their backs. They kept their heads bowed, refusing to make eye contact with the furious woman on stage. Their manager had relayed the ownership transfer through their earpieces. They knew exactly who wrote their paychecks now. I ascended the stairs. Vivian was frantically tapping her dead microphone against the acrylic podium. The dull, hollow thuds echoed uselessly into the silent room. She looked down at me as I crested the final step. The manufactured sorrow had completely vanished from her face. Her meticulously applied makeup suddenly looked incredibly harsh and brittle. Sweat was breaking through her expensive foundation, and her hands were visibly trembling. She shrank back instinctively as I approached, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edges of the podium to keep her balance. I stepped up to the acrylic stand. I did not shove her. I simply moved into her physical space with an immovable, dominant presence that forced her to step aside. She stumbled sideways, her sapphire gown catching awkwardly under her heel. I reached down to the lower shelf of the podium and retrieved the hardwired emergency backup microphone. I flipped the heavy switch at the base. A sharp burst of static crackled through the pristine surround sound speakers before settling into a low, powerful hum. "Security won't be removing me, Vivian," I say, my voice ringing clear, cold, and entirely authoritative through the massive ballroom. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. Vivian's mouth opened and closed silently, her eyes darting frantically toward the back of the room, searching for the event staff, searching for anyone to save her. No one moved. Because as of 9 a.m. this morning, my LLC purchased the debt on this venue. I state, turning my gaze out toward the hundreds of stunned faces before looking directly back at my mother. I own this building. The statement dropped like an anvil. Several guests at the front tables physically recoiled. Judge Carmichael lowered his glasses, staring intently at the stage. I own the catering company you haven't paid in 3 months. I continue turning the knife with surgical precision. And most importantly, I own the microphone. Oh. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The absolute destruction of her social standing was happening in real-time broadcast across the massive digital screens flanking the stage. The elite crowd she had spent her entire life worshipping was now listening to the undeniable, humiliating truth of her financial insolvency. The expensive caviar they were eating, the vintage champagne they were drinking, the very chairs they were sitting on, it was all funded by unpaid invoices and crippling corporate debt that I now controlled entirely. She had stood on my stage and called me a broken, jealous failure. Down on the floor, Kendra was completely unraveling. She had abandoned her seat at the VIP table, her expensive designer dress stained with the champagne she had dropped. She was screaming frantically at the local politicians, sitting beside her, demanding they intervene, demanding they call the police. But no one moved to help her. The wealthy and powerful do not align themselves with a sinking ship. They simply sit back and watch the wreckage burn. Kendra lunged toward the stage stairs, her face twisted in an ugly, desperate rage, but the 2 security guards immediately stepped forward, crossing their massive arms and blocking her path entirely. She was trapped on the floor, forced to watch her carefully curated world disintegrate. I turned my attention back to the acrylic podium. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my emerald clutch. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. A stark contrast to the chaotic, hyperventilating panic radiating from Vivian standing just 3 feet away. I located the heavy auxiliary cord resting next to the soundboard interface on the podium. I picked it up and plugged it directly into the base of my phone. A green connection light flared on the audio interface panel. I looked out at the silent, suffocatingly tense ballroom. "Let's talk about excellence, shall we?" I say softly, my voice laced with a lethal, razor-sharp edge. I unlocked my screen, navigated directly to the audio file I had extracted from the hidden security cameras in my home, and pressed play. The pristine, high-definition audio cut through the ballroom speakers with devastating clarity. It did not sound muffled or distorted. It sounded exactly as if Vivian and Kendra were standing at the podium, speaking directly into the microphone. I watched the crowd's reaction as Kendra's shrill, arrogant voice echoed off the gold-leafed walls. "You just need to make sure the bag is shoved all the way to the back of the cabinet," Kendra's recorded voice instructed, dripping with malicious excitement. "Terrence already wiped the glass pipe, so his prints are gone. Once the narcotics are under her sink, Terrence makes the anonymous tip to the precinct. Jasmine gets arrested for possession, the family court pulls her custody rights immediately, and Terrence gets direct administrative access to Malik's $500,000 trust fund by Monday morning." A wave of absolute horrified revulsion swept through the gala. Senator Hayes dropped his napkin, staring at the stage with open, unadulterated disgust. The wives of the real estate moguls covered their mouths in shock. This was not a rumor. This was not a piece of quiet, easily deniable society gossip. This was a recorded, explicit confession of a felony conspiracy to frame a mother and steal from a child. The audio continued, transitioning seamlessly to Vivian's unmistakable, haughty tone. "Make sure Terrence transfers my cut of the trust to the catering vendor immediately," Vivian's voice commanded through the speakers, cementing her absolute guilt. "I will not suffer the embarrassment of a cancelled gala just because Preston lacks the spine to manage his firm's ledgers. Jasmine has always been a stubborn, ungrateful, difficult burden. It is about time her precious career served a genuine purpose for this family." I reached down and paused the audio. The silence that followed was completely deafening. The illusion was dead. The pristine holy image of the deeply devoted matriarch leading her family through a spiritual attack was permanently shattered, replaced by the ugly, undeniable reality of a desperate broke woman willing to frame her own daughter for a felony just to pay for a charity dinner. I looked at Vivian. She was staring out at the crowd, her mouth hanging open, her eyes darting frantically from table to table. She was waiting for someone, anyone, to offer a word of support, to offer a shred of sympathy. But the audience looked back at her with nothing but cold, clinical contempt. The people she worshipped had just heard her explicitly confess to a monstrous crime. Her social execution was absolute. I unplugged my phone, slipping the device back into my clutch. I stepped away from the microphone, leaving Vivian standing paralyzed in the harsh red light of the stage entirely alone, as the distant sound of police sirens began to wail loudly from the downtown streets outside the hotel. The pristine high-definition audio recording of Vivian and Kendra conspiring to commit a felony hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the sheer magnitude of the revelation registered with the crowd. Then the grand ballroom of the Beaumont Hotel absolutely erupted. The hushed, suffocating silence violently shattered into a chaotic symphony of gasps, furious whispers, and outright shouts of disbelief. This was not a vague rumor circulated over mimosas at a country club. This was an undeniable, explicit confession broadcast directly into the ears of hundreds of Atlanta's most influential political and social figures. I stood behind the acrylic podium, my posture perfectly rigid, and watched the devastating social execution unfold in real time. Senator Hayes, the man Vivian had relentlessly lobbied and flattered for 6 consecutive months just to secure his presence at her VIP table, physically stood up. He did not look toward the stage. He simply turned his back, signaling to his security detail that he was leaving immediately. It was a clear, brutal gesture of political excommunication. The society matron's women who had happily sipped imported tea in Vivian's parlor just weeks ago now covered their mouths in performative horror. Their eyes were wide, glittering with the absolute thrill of witnessing a spectacular, ruinous downfall. The people Vivian had catered to her entire life, the exact audience she worshipped, as the ultimate judges of her worth, were currently looking at her with undisguised disgust. On stage, Vivian physically crumbled under the weight of their collective contempt. Her knees completely gave out. She collapsed heavily into a velvet-upholstered chair positioned just behind the podium. Her meticulously applied makeup looked incredibly harsh and brittle under the unforgiving red emergency lighting. She threw her manicured hands over her face, attempting to hide from the hundreds of accusing eyes staring up at her. She was whimpering a high, panicked sound that was entirely lost in the rising volume of the ballroom. Suddenly, a violent commotion erupted near the front row of the banquet tables. Preston was charging toward the stage. He had been sitting near Kendra, out on his astronomically high federal bail, an electronic monitoring ankle bracelet strapped securely beneath his tailored trousers. He had just heard the audio. He realized instantly that the recording not only implicated Vivian and Kendra in a narcotics frame-up, but it completely destroyed whatever fragile legal leverage he thought he possessed. Preston was a man who relied exclusively on physical intimidation to get his way when his legal maneuvering failed him. He used his massive size to bully opposing counsel, terrify witnesses, and dominate boardrooms. He had absolutely no power here, but his sheer hubris drove him forward. He let out a guttural, furious roar, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. He leaped onto the first step of the stage, his heavy dress shoes pounding against the wood. He was lunging directly toward the podium, his hands outstretched violently, determined to rip the auxiliary cord from the soundboard and physically stop the audio from looping. He did not even make it to the second step. The 2 massive private security guards, the men who had marched down the center aisle just moments ago with orders from Vivian to throw me out, instantly pivoted. Their panicked manager had relayed the corporate ownership transfer through their earpieces. They knew exactly who owned the building. They knew exactly whose signature was on their contracting firm's master invoice. They moved with brutal, terrifying efficiency. The guards intercepted Preston mid-charge, hitting his massive frame like twin freight trains. They grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo and slammed him violently against the paneled wall of the stage perimeter. The physical impact was loud and incredibly satisfying. Preston grunted in pain, his face smashed against the decorative woodwork. "Get your hands off me!" Preston roared, spit flying from his lips as he thrashed against their grip. "Do you know who I am?" The guards did not care who he was. One guard drove a heavy knee into the back of Preston's thigh, forcing him to buckle, while the other wrenched Preston's arms aggressively behind his back. The sharp, distinct ratcheting sound of heavy-duty plastic zip ties cutting through the ambient noise of the crowd signaled the absolute end of Preston's authority. The former high-powered, untouchable corporate attorney was neutralized, struggling and red-faced, reduced to nothing more than a restrained thug in front of the very people he used to golf with. I ignored his pathetic struggles entirely. I turned away from the podium and walked slowly over to the chair where Vivian was weeping into her hands. I stood over her, my shadow falling across her trembling shoulders. I looked directly down at my mother, my voice entirely unwavering, carrying no anger, only the cold, heavy weight of absolute truth. "You called me a failure because I did not marry for money, and I did not beg for your approval." I stated, the acoustics of the stage carrying my words to the first few rows of silent watching guests. "You put a white man on a pedestal who stole millions from his own clients, and you actively sacrificed your own flesh and blood to protect your fragile social status. You were willing to send the mother of your grandson to prison just to pay for a charity dinner." Vivian lowered her hands. Her face was a wet, ruined mask of mascara and absolute terror. She looked up at me, her lips trembling as she tried to form a coherent sentence, trying desperately to find a lie that could save her from the reality of the room. I did not give her the opportunity to speak. I unclasped my emerald silk clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of officially notarized property deeds. I held them by the corner for a brief second before dropping them directly onto her lap. The heavy paper hit the beaded fabric of her sapphire gown with a definitive hollow thud. Vivian stared down at the documents, her eyes darting across the legal seals and the prominent banking logos printed on the header. "You leveraged your Buckhead estate to post Preston's bail," I explained smoothly, my tone strictly analytical, as if I were dissecting a routine corporate merger. "It was a terrible, desperate financial decision. When he defaults on his legal obligations, and he absolutely will, the bank will immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings on your home." Vivian gasped, her hands shaking violently as she hovered over the paperwork, terrified to actually touch it. "But do not worry," I continued, leaning in slightly, ensuring she heard every single syllable. "I bought the mortgage. My LLC purchased the debt portfolio from your commercial lender 2 hours ago. I am the sole lien holder on the property. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property." The wail of police sirens that had been growing steadily louder outside the Beaumont Hotel suddenly reached a deafening crescendo. The heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom were pushed open by a dozen uniformed Atlanta police officers. The elite crowd parted for them, like the Red Sea shrinking away from the center aisle to avoid any association with the impending arrests. The officers marched directly toward the VIP table to apprehend Kendra, who was sobbing hysterically onto the ruined tablecloth, and toward the stage to collect Vivian. I turned my back on the stage, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers above. They had spent decades trying to write me out of their story. Now they had no story left. 6 months later, the dust from the catastrophic collapse of Vivian's carefully curated empire had finally settled into a hard, permanent reality. The immediate aftermath of the gala was a total scorched earth devastation for my antagonists. The viral footage of Vivian being led out of her own charity event in handcuffs, combined with the leaked audio of her felony conspiracy, rendered her and Kendra entirely socially radioactive. The prominent figures they had spent their lives flattering immediately severed all ties. They were banned from their country clubs, expelled from their philanthropic committees, and shunned by the very people they had bankrupted themselves trying to impress. The justice system processed their hubris with methodical cruelty, Preston's federal embezzlement trial was a brief, spectacular media circus that ended in an absolute conviction. Stripped of his arrogance and his legal maneuvers, he was nothing more than a common thief. He is currently sitting in a medium-security federal prison, serving a mandatory 10-year sentence. His prestigious law license is permanently revoked, and every asset he ever managed to hide was seized by federal marshals to pay restitution to the clients he defrauded. Terrence faced a similarly bleak reality. Unable to afford a competent defense attorney and confronted with the irrefutable fingerprint evidence on the narcotics pipe and the recorded conspiracy audio, his bravado completely evaporated. He accepted a harsh, unforgiving plea deal from the district attorney for the felony drug frame-up. He is serving 3 years behind bars in a state facility. But the criminal sentence was only a fraction of his punishment. As a direct condition of his plea agreement combined with the overwhelming evidence presented in family court, Terrence suffered the total irrevocable termination of his parental rights. He is legally permanently excised from Malik's life. There will be no more extortion attempts. There will be no more manipulative custody filings. There will be no more weekends spent agonizing over my son's physical safety. Terrence is a ghost. I enforced the 30-day eviction notice on the Buckhead estate down to the very last available minute. When the deadline expired, the sheriff's deputies arrived to change the locks, forcing Vivian and Kendra out onto the street with nothing but the clothes they could fit into a few suitcases. Stripped of their assets, socially blacklisted, and buried under a mountain of insurmountable legal fees from their own ongoing conspiracy charges, they were forced into a bleak, unrecognizable new existence. They are currently living together in a cramped, poorly ventilated 2-bedroom apartment in a dismal, forgotten suburb on the far outskirts of the city. To afford their monthly rent and basic groceries, they are working entry-level retail jobs. Kendra spends her days under harsh fluorescent lights folding discounted denim and organizing clearance racks at a dying department store. Vivian, the woman who once believed she was the undisputed queen of Atlanta society, now stands behind a cash register for 8 hours a day. She is forced to wear a polyester uniform, forced to smile, and forced to serve the very working-class people she spent her entire life looking down upon. The poetic justice of their daily routine is absolute, and I do not lose a single second of sleep over their misery. I sat back, sinking comfortably into the plush cushions of the outdoor furniture on the sprawling wraparound cedar porch of my new estate. The morning air was crisp and incredibly clean, carrying the fresh scent of pine needles and morning dew. The property was massive, heavily gated, and surrounded by acres of ancient, protective oak trees. I held a large ceramic mug of dark roast coffee in my hands, letting the comforting heat seep into my palms. Out in the vast, perfectly manicured green expanse of the front yard, Malik was running full sprint. He was laughing loudly, a bright, unburdened sound that echoed across the property, throwing a bright yellow tennis ball for his wildly energetic new golden retriever puppy. His childhood was finally secure. He was completely insulated from the toxic narcissism, the manipulation, and the endless, suffocating pressure of my former family. He was just a boy playing in the sun exactly as he was meant to be. My financial auditing firm had tripled in size over the last 2 quarters. The high-profile nature of my corporate buyout of the Beaumont Hotel, combined with my pristine, unshakable reputation for ethical auditing, had secured massive long-term contracts with several international conglomerates. My wealth, heavily guarded and diversified entirely legal offshore holding accounts and domestic trusts, guaranteed generational security for my son and his future children. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, complex flavor. I looked out over the rolling green hills of my property, watching the morning light catch the leaves of the oak trees. For the first time in my 35 years on this earth, the air I breathed belonged entirely to me. It was not filtered through Vivian's expectations or tainted by Terrence's resentment. I was no longer an invisible prop in someone else's play. I didn't just survive the terrible consuming fire they set for me. I used the flames to forge my crown. The most profound lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding and diminishing you. When toxic family members try to extinguish your light to preserve their fragile egos, the most powerful revenge is not merely survival, but spectacular success, built entirely on your own terms. True power comes from establishing impenetrable boundaries, securing your independence, and refusing to play a rigged game. By actively walking away from their manipulative narrative, you create the space to forge your own crown and build a life grounded in authenticity and unshakable self-respect. If this story of reclaiming your power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering journeys of triumph over toxic family dynamics.